Alison Paprisa, and on behalf of the Vector Institute, we're very pleased to welcome you to our inaugural Health AI Rounds. When I say on behalf of the Vector Institute, I say it on behalf of our President and CEO, Garth Gibson, the Chair of our board, Ed Clark, Andrea Proctor, who's been working with me as Director of Healthcare Engagement, and our Vector Health faculty, most importantly, several of whom are with us here today. Vector's vision, as you can see, is to have excellence and leadership in AI that goes all the way to improving the lives of Canadians. And the way that we've set the course to do this in the short term is through our health strategy phase 1. As the name implies, a phase 2 will follow. But to start, it's about foundational work in 3 areas. World-class research. This means attracting and retraining world-class researchers like Anna and Frank, who are with us in the room today, Quaid Morris, who I don't think can join us, but I know would like to if he wasn't traveling, and Marjay Gassimi, who's going to be joining us shortly. And also supporting their students, because it's through their students that we'll have a bigger and more widespread impact. Equally, on world-class research, it's about events like today that help bring our researchers together with the health research community more broadly, computer scientists, policy specialists, legal specialists, so that we can generate new collaborations with even broader impact. We're not just about world-class research. Widespread application is within our mandate. You're going to see in the very short term that we announce a small number of what we call Pathfinder projects intended to show concrete benefits from machine learning in the short term, next 12 to 18 months, and also Vector's work to increase the number of talented individuals broadly, not just in machine learning and deep learning, but in data science and other topics. And of course, it all relies on data. This is how we'll do our work. And on that point, that's really why we're here today. I want to emphasize that Vector and our partners has a very strong commitment to responsible AI, and you'll see it in many places. You'll see it, as it turns out, in the research program of our research director, Rich Semmel, and his focus on machine learning and fairness. You'll see it in the historic announcement that came from CFAR last week about a Canada-France collaboration on responsible AI. And you'll see it in the ways that we engage directly with the public to ensure that we maintain trust as we work with data partners like the Institute for Clinical and Data Sciences to make sure that we can extract benefits from the data holdings which we are uniquely privileged to be stewards for. But one of the things that you find, even with that orientation towards trust and public involvement, is that when it comes time to do the work, very often it seems like the conversation shifts towards risk. What are the risks to privacy? What are the risks of black box decisions, etc. And it's just a bit unbalanced for those of us, like many in the room, who work in the field. Because again, this is about improving lives. We are seeking benefits. And so how do we have something to say, when you've got the law on one side, and on the other side you maybe have good intentions, but they seem a little less firm than the law when you're talking about it. So that's why we are so very pleased that Bartha Knoppers could join us today to kick off our Health AI Rounds. I'll just briefly mention as people are coming in, a funny story. I saw a very similar presentation that Bartha made at Health Canada organized symposium on AI. And that was, for the most part, limited to government employees. So it's great that she can come and share the message more broadly. Almost as soon as I heard her present, I thought this would be the perfect way to kick off our Health AI Rounds. And I actually wrote you a couple of emails, which I'm sure just got lost in the mailbox. And then finally I thought, I'm going to call Bartha and see if there's any way I can connect personally. And literally on the phone, Bartha said, I heard her speaking to her assistant, you know that event in Toronto on June 18th that's not happening? Did we cancel my flight yet? And her assistant said, no. And she said, how's June 18th? And I said, it is perfect. Because really, it is perfect in terms of what Bartha is going to speak about and her background. You will have seen her bio in the invite that went out. Just briefly as you read along, Bartha is the Canada Research Chair in Law and Medicine. She was a member of the drafting group for the recommendations of the OECD Council on Health Data Governance. She is a recognized international expert with multiple honorary degrees and so distinguished as to be awarded both the Order of Canada and the Order of Quebec. She's going to speak to us today on the topic of data sharing and the human right to benefit from science and its applications. Please join me in welcoming Bartha.
thanks, and it's great to be here. The reason the phone works is that I'm actually quite old-fashioned and not very techy at all. So it's a privilege to talk to you about a human right that very few people know about, and even fewer have actually realized, and that's the right to benefit from science and its applications. And so I'll start with, what is this right? Because I have to confess, before 2013, even though I was legally trained and I'm married to a human rights law professor, I thought I knew all the rights, and I didn't know that this right existed. So we'll start with the right, then I'll go through 3 sort of decades that preceded this right, and where the resolution of different issues will probably affect whether this right to benefit will actually activate one day. And then look at the end at where we're going to go with this, what we're going to do about it. So the first time that this right appeared was in the 1948 Declaration, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And if you see, it's 27(1). It talks, together with cultural rights, the right to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. And in the same article, it doesn't say, give everything away, don't worry, no patents. It recognizes IP as a legitimate form of the right to benefit from science and its applications. So it's actually a twin right, the right of citizens to benefit, of anyone to benefit, and the right of contributors and inventors to be recognized for their work. So that's quite important, but I'm not going to talk about the IP part unless you ask questions on it. So I did some research. Where did this come from? And if you look in the study that followed the adoption of the Universal Declaration, you see that already at that time there was this notion that this could be a revolutionary right, and that this participation doesn't mean just receiving benefits or therapies and so on, but it treats participation in the scientific enterprise as one of the benefits of science to which we all have a right. So it's an interesting concept. So why use human rights? Well, contrary to, or perhaps I shouldn't say that, complementary to bioethics or law, let's call it that, human rights are universal, so they're not national or limited by different political and or cultural boundaries. So they complement bioethics, and they tend to be more positive. In other words, it's especially in biomedical research, where there's still very much that, as you were mentioning, risk, protection. How do we frame this in a way to make sure as much as possible that that nothing can ever happen, untoward will ever happen either to the data or to persons participating in research and so on. It is a more positive way, if you like, of situating science and biomedical research in a positive way. And you can actually do something about it. In other words, it's actionable because it's legal, so it belongs to groups, it belongs to all citizens, and you can actually hold your government to account for what it has or has not done with respect to this right. The best part is that in 1976, in Article 15, they took up Article 27 of the Universal Declaration, and they made it legally actionable because it's not just a declaration, it became part of an international covenant. And if you're in an international covenant or treaty and the country has signed and ratified it, that means it has legal force in your own domestic or national context. So we, Canada signed and ratified, we can say to our Canadian government, what have you done about this? What have you done since 1976 when it was signed and ratified? The content finally started to interest in international organizations such as UNESCO, because it's in their mission, science is in their mission, to how do we interpret it? What does it mean? And in the Venice Statement of 2009, they started addressing the issue from sort of a government and entities point of view. So this statement identified the different roles of the different actors and so on, and was taken up by the AAAS in the United States 1 year later. the American Association for the Advancement of Science decided to poll all its members across all the different science domains and ask the members how they saw this right, or what it meant to them in physics or plants or human biomedical research and so on. And in 2014, the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health took this right as its foundation. In other words, the whole framework of the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health is built on the human right to benefit. So it's totally turning everything on its head and saying this is science is a positive force in society. And all the policies and tools and framework for the responsible sharing of genomic and health-related information are based on the framework. So science got its answers back from its 3,462 scientists who responded. And this is how they thought the right could become real for them. Of course, we all say this. First thing, more funding. Second, adequate science education. And I think there's no doubt that digital literacy, or in the field I work in a lot, genomic literacy and so on, is very important. Promote a positive view of science. I find in ethics committees and so on, there's still what I call the Nuremberg effect, that somehow the scientists have to overcome the presumption that they might or are doing something that can harm, and then only then do they get the green light to go ahead. Ensure open access and promote and protect academic freedom. So that's the broad science community speaking. Interestingly, because it was international, this survey, is that the European and North American scientists found access to the literature, to data, to be the way to further this right, whereas the Caribbean and Latin Americans saw it more as a right to benefit from applications of the science. So you can see the difference based on their geographical and also political, socioeconomic situations. So a scholar from Cambridge and myself decided to look through all the reports. Countries who sign and ratify treaties have to report into the United Nations as a country how they've done, you know, like a report card kind of reporting. We went through all the reports from all 167 countries since 1976, and to see, did any of them put it in their own laws? 76 did, and 83 out of the 167 said, we've taken concrete measures to realize this right. And the creation of databases was the most commonly adopted measure, but only since 1990. So you can see the influence of the internet on how this right is being perceived and realized. And totally separate studies from the AAAS questionnaire, we found that a growing number of developed and developing states saw this right to give access to scientific information, that it ought to be in an open access and open science approach. And I think we're seeing funders now with their obligations to have your data sharing plan. Here in Canada, two pages in the last LSAR competition. So this is beginning to permeate the Canadian scientific community and Canadian government as well. And the right to access, however, is more controversial. Here again, the split between developed and developing states. One seeing it as a transfer of technology from academia to industry as being a way of getting the benefits out there, and the developing states seeing more as getting international transfer of technology so that they can move apace. And then finally, a year ago, UNESCO revisited its recommendation on science and scientific researchers and started to stress the value of science as a common good, and that the open communication of results, hypotheses, and so on provides the strongest guarantee of the accuracy and objectivity of scientific results. And the most perhaps important part is if you look at the international aspect, because that's most of what I do is international comparative, you'll see in under 21 to have policies to facilitate scientific research, but also to ensure the human right to share in scientific advancement, member states should establish and facilitate mechanisms for collaborative open science and facilitate sharing of scientific knowledge while ensuring that other rights are respected. And recently, the whole citizen science movement has picked up on this, what they call sleeping beauty right, and tried to claim it as one of their own ways of realizing their participation in science as citizens. And they see it as a actionable agenda with citizens themselves, not only participating in the framing of science or in actual research, but also in the funding priorities and so on. Okay, so that's the Sleeping Beauty right, and it's this fall the United Nations will be coming out on its report 70 years following the Universal Declaration on Article 15. So I'm standing here, I should say, with a bunch of scientists all interested in data, and lots of it, and especially data from different sources. The aim, obviously, being better therapies, more personalized medicine, more precise medicine, and you can only do that if you have not just data, but lots of data and diversified data, and also data from in the population, in the heterogeneous population that represents the Canadian context today. And some of my research, geospatial, for instance, I found to be much more controversial. When you put geospatial data together with, let's say, UK Biobank data, you can actually predict property values and where they live, by where their health is, whether there's sidewalks, whether there's fresh fruit and vegetables, and so on, or public transport. And actually, if you were to make that data public, their own property, in quotes, could be devalued and so on, which was an economic harm as much as people see genomic information as being a personal harm. But suffice it to say that the international science and the open science based on a common good approach, is growing at an astonishing rate. And to illustrate this, this is a map of collaborations between 2005 and 2009. And if the top of North America is not there, it's because it's just ice and polar bears and so on. It's not because there's no science in Canada. Canada's there. But look at it, there's whole continents missing. There's whole parts of the world that we're not collaborating in that time period. And look at this one. This is now the 2002 to 2008 map of scientific collaborations. And you can see the incredible change in international scientific collaboration. So the picture is worth 1,000 words, as they say. And it's very encouraging to see this. So what are we building this new science as a common good for the benefit of citizens? What are we building it on? So let's start with what I call the static model, the traditional model. And that's the approach that was adopted between 1990 and 2000. Now, as you know, 1990 saw the beginning of the Human Genome Project. And in dealing with the ethics of the Human Genome Project, we didn't have much to go by except codes of ethics of physicians or the Tri-Council policy statement. I think it was still in gestation then, so we were probably using MRC. We had the whole notion of genetic exceptionalism, that genes are bad, they're hereditary, they're like the Greek gods with their fates visiting, and that people had a view of genetics and genomics and the whole endeavor to map the human genome as something that could harm as much as it could benefit. Here in Canada, we've finally had a decision, Supreme Court of Canada and Rival versus Hughes, that actually elevated the patient from only the physician deciding what the patient should hear or know about before they consented to one saying it matters what the particular patient thinks or wants or understands, what the reasonable patient would want to know, or reasonable research participant. The individual human rights model was still very strong, We had codes of ethics. We had the Oviedo Convention in Europe on biomedicine and human rights, but mainly autonomy, privacy, justice, and so on, and the rise of research ethics committees and so on. So very, very cautionary, careful approach, and very prudent, and perhaps with reason. But the public health model was also being built at this time. The newborn screening became internationally recognized as a good way of finding asymptomatic children, at-risk asymptomatic children, and treating them. We start seeing networking in the malaria, for instance, genomic epidemiology network in Africa, and we see cancer as the prototype for the first common disease where different novel kinds of research and outcomes were being proposed. And we also saw that no disease is just one disease. And this is the Barabasi, one of the authors of complex systems theory, who constructed this map that he called the diseaseome, because as I found out when I had to reconsent 10,000 women because the consent form mentioned breast cancer but didn't mention ovarian, and so the ethics committee said, it doesn't say ovarian, you can't use those samples, you can't use that data. We found out that ovarian and breast cancer and other cancers are all interrelated, and the same for hypertension and so on, diabetes. And this is a beautiful constellation illustrating this notion of going beyond single disease models. All right, and then what happened? Well, I mentioned the complex systems approach. You see terms appearing like in the Human Genome, Hugo Ethics Committee said that the human genome at the level of the human genome, so human as opposed to animal or plant, was the common heritage of humanity. And like the law of the sea, or like space. And thus should be protected, preserved, and furthered in the interests of humanity at that level. And this came up again in UNESCO in its own declaration of 1997. You see data and databases being called a community resource. This was some NIH language around mid-1990s. And you see transparency beginning with the obligation to register trials so that people could see who was doing what, where, and so on. So the idea of a commons of information became more acceptable. And Hugo itself called databases as public goods. This is when population biobanks appeared. They were very contested here. The UK Biobank started in 2002, but with the idea, again, even in the UK, this was a hard struggle to get this idea of infrastructure science supporting discovery science, and to have a longitudinal cohorts, just like our Canadian Longitudinal Study in Aging, our Canadian Partnership for Tomorrow project here in Canada. It took an incredible amount of work to convince ethics committees that broad consent to future unspecified research, as approved by an ethics committee, so not without governance or oversight, was actually legal, that people should be allowed to consent to future unspecified research, and that's the kind of infrastructure consent that is required. DTC stands for direct to consumer. I won't go into that. 23andMe, the uses for research, the genealogy, ancestry.com, and so on and so on. And citizen science, as I just mentioned. And finally, in this second sort of decade, we also see the interest in rare diseases and the role that rare diseases can play in common. And I must say, having worked with the rare disease community, if there was anything in the new General Data Protection Regulation that is pro-science, if you find it in there, it's because of their advocacy in making sure that the data protection regulation left room for science, domains or areas of science to be acceptable. Whole genome sequencing, big data, I'll probably come back to that. I think probably in the next decade, we will be just sequencing because the costs will go down, and the precision and the information it gives us, if put together with electronic health records and put together with other data, will be invaluable for healthcare systems and for individual treatment. And finally, epigenetics and systems biology. Epigenetics raises lots of ethical issues, because working in a study with women, the fear was that it would reveal alcoholism in the family or lifestyle issues that could be stigmatizing and harmful. So, what are we going to do if we have this whole genome sequencing data and big data? How do we store it? How can we use it? Lincoln Stein isn't here, but this is his article about creating, you can't move the data anymore, so you go to the data and you store and compute in a cloud environment. But if he were here, he'd probably tell you about the year that it took to get a contract with a cloud service provider where you could adjust some of the clauses. The clauses just go on the net, you'll see the standard contracts. To say, well, this is medical data. Maybe people don't want it to go to certain areas of the world, or maybe they'd like some notification if you're going to move it to another cloud. Or maybe your algorithms should be adjusted for some of the specific needs of the biomedical research, and so on. And it took a while to persuade them that there were special needs of this community. And here is where you guys come in with your interest in artificial intelligence in healthcare. And if you can read what's on the slide, it says the creation of data-driven predictions underpins personalized medicine and precision public health. Medical practice has so far been largely unchanged by the digital revolution that has disrupted so many other industries. But perhaps artificial intelligence will provide the improvements in medical care and research promised for so long. And I think artificial intelligence and machine learning will do that. But we're not set up for that kind of integration, if you like. I don't know how far ahead you guys are with your electronic medical records being interoperable across hospitals, across cities. Remember, what was it called, Alan? The Infoway 10 years ago?
The Health Infoway.
Health Infoway was supposed to prepare Canada for this?
Traffic jam.
What?
The traffic jam.
The traffic jam. Come to Montreal if you want to see traffic jams. And use of liquid biopsies, you're becoming your own control over time. It's really interesting. Cellular genomics, the confluence or convergence of stem cell research with genomic research, and the whole contribution of citizens to their health by recording their own activities and so on through e-health apps. The biggest challenge, I think, is not the first one, well maybe, is also the interoperability. In the Genomic Alliance in the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, we're doing our best to not standardize, that's ISO's job, but to harmonize in some sort of concordant way the language that we use and the APIs, the machine-readable consents, how to use legacy data, legacy samples, all of it obviously in data-intensive science. And this is an ongoing battle, which obviously is magnified at the international level. I have to say this because I'm in Ontario. So I know that privacy by design was born here in Ontario. And yet the language used, if you say de-identified in a consent form, depending where the consent form comes from, I will know what it means, and I know it means something different in the United States. It's HIPAA. De-identified is more an adjective or a verb in Canada, but I don't know if you mean anonymized or if you mean coded. Now, in the new General Data Protection Regulation, they use pseudonymized, which means coded. So a Global Alliance did a data lexicon with 13 lawyers from 13 countries doing a concordance of what these terms mean, so you know what you can or cannot do with the data and samples when you receive it. Internationally, we have self-recruitment, we have an interest in population diversity. I love that topic, but I won't go into it. And more targeted research for public health purposes. So stratification based on risk probabilities and regrouping into new subpopulations with sort of a mixer effect. In fact, stratification might lead to the destigmatization, if you like, of a lot of genomic information. Because you could be at risk for something, let's say diabetes, high risk, low risk for cancer, average population risk for something else, and you'll be thrown in not by gender or by region or by ethnicity, but by probabilities of risk. So maybe we'll all talk about risk, genomic risk, like the weather one day. We'll just have a cup of coffee and say, I'm high for this, I'm low for that, what about you? And we'll all get it down to being normal medical information. But I think that might be a dream for another decade. So where does that bring us in terms of AI and the future, having done 3 decades in 15 minutes? This is the ideal. This is really where we want to get to, is research to clinic, clinic back to research, research back to clinic, and so on, in a health learning system. And so these feedback loops. You bring this up to administrators and they say, no can do. We're protecting our data. We're protecting, as the physicians, we're protecting our patients. It's confidentiality. We can't share. We can't have this continual flow back and forth and so on, and even if patients consent to it, because we need to know where it is, who's doing what, and of course you need to know who's doing what, and has to be approved. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't work towards this feedback loop. It means that the ethics for research and the ethics for patient care, which have been nicely separated, and you can even separate certain kinds of liability as well, based on those 2 separate schools of thought and protections, will have to coalesce and be completely changed. So how will policymakers approach AI? If you look in the literature, let's see, reliability, safety, quality, reproducibility, validation. These are the issues that come up first, rather than how will it improve on a systems level, a more systematic, systemic approach to healthcare. So there's still a lot of doubts out there, and I think scandals such as the Cambridge Analytics and so on has not helped at all in trying to convince people of the importance of big data, sharing data, and so on. So you get constant queries, which is good, because if people are asking questions and they're worried, that's because we're not communicating. Obviously, we're not saying what we're doing and why. And so if they hear about something, it throws suspicion over the whole data intensive science community. And this is a recent one from, I think, the New England Journal of Medicine, but I'm not sure, saying that we have to catch up with this. Most of our guidance is on interventionist research, on devices, on samples, not at all with data-intensive research in mind. And the idea of the physician as the fiduciary is going to change. We're going to move to patients in healthcare systems, not doctor-patients, but a different kind of relationship, which makes the need to re-examine confidentiality central to the enterprise. You get the doubters and the naysayers about artificial intelligence and needing more rigor. That's an emerging science. I think that's probably true to say, and definitely an issue. And you also get the kinds of books and magazines and so on, as you can see here, about machine learning reinforcing biases in research, be they racial, gender, age-related, and so on. Weapons of math destruction, I think I love that one. Automating inequality. algorithms of oppression. Wow, we've got a lot of work to do to, I think, better explain how it works, and why you're doing it, and how you're doing it, and how you're prospectively addressing issues. And that brings me to the last part. How can you create, how can you have the right to benefit, support the right, activate the right, faced with these challenges? And the one school of thought that's emerging is looking at models of anticipatory governance. So not like the Human Genome Project, when you get a call from NIH and say, oh, we've put together the money from around the world, we're ready to go, we're going to start mapping. Before they even say, what does mapping mean? How will the public see mapping? Why are they using public funds for mapping? What does that mean? So we have to think ahead. How can we anticipate not only perceptions, which may be false or ill-grounded or whatever, but also the realities of experience of 3 decades by looking forward? And there's all kinds of foresight theory that looks ahead and looks at innovations and anticipating risks and benefits, as well as the possible and unanticipated end uses or dual uses, and so on. This is one of my favorites. I think I've had this slide for 20 years now. These are ethics committees. I had to do 18 ethics committees for one population biobank in Quebec called Cartagena, and I have decided that the system needs some retooling. It needs, you can spend as a researcher probably 60% of your time not doing research, but administering projects or filling in ethics reports or appearing in front of ethics committees. One, I don't think that, while we have data access committees now, thank goodness, and they have IT people on there, they have cloud people on there, they have EPI people and so on, data people on them. What we don't have is, with the whole genome sequencing and the return of results quandary, where do researchers go? The ethics committees are not equipped to know which results are medically actionable and should be returned. And so we might have to make sure that those kinds of issues don't fall into the hands of either the data access or the ethics committees, but probably need clinical expert committees to help researchers decide when something should be returned or could be returned or not returned at all. You have interesting approaches. The UK has started, or starting this fall in September, all cancer patients coming into the NHS will be sequenced. And so they've made an across-the-board decision that they're starting to integrate sequencing, whole genome sequencing into their healthcare system. And they see that information as normal medical information that's part of the medical chart that will be understood over time. What's benign, what's pathogenic, what's variant of unknown significance, and so on. And I mentioned the EU General Data Protection Regulation. Well, if you look at the bottom, you'll see that this GDPR is set to promote a controller-based, case-sensitive, context-specific approach. Every country has to have a data protection officer. It's the right to know, the right not to know, the right to access. All these rights are now the rights of individuals, as opposed to society deciding what you should be protected from or not know, and so on. Luckily, there is a carve-out for science in the public interest, statistical, historical, and scientific research in the public interest or legitimate interest, which some companies are using. And there also is an article that says you can consent to a domain or an area of research, and not specific, specific research projects. So in conclusion, looking at what kind of policy is being recommended, this is sort of the self-regulatory approach, I guess, because in this article they suggest that we have an independent, international, multi-stakeholder process for consultation on AI and ethics. And UNESCO just came out with a terrific report, by the way, on AI and big data. Excellent, excellent report. So you can see, and I think they're also going to, the International Bioethics Committee is going to probably prepare something on this. But I would do it here as well if you're leading the way. In Ontario, this is definitely an instrument where you can involve citizens, scientists, patients, administrators, and so on. Nature Genetics came out with this very interesting view on sharing of genetic and family history information. Again, reiterating this public good. You cannot run a healthcare system on individual choices. There has to be possibilities for data to automatically be fed into a system that can judge the quality of care, can readjust, and hopefully one day with whole genome sequencing, be more precise and personalized. And to be precise and personalized, you cannot be anonymized. The GDPR says anonymized data is not personal data. It's not about a person. It's about an aggregate of data representing a group or population and so on. So to do that, we're going to have to take the big, bold step and start linking, not just linking databases, linking records, being able to get back to people. There has to be keys, there have to be stewards, there has to be coded, and so on. But we cannot promise precision or personalized medicine when there are no persons, when there only are anonymized data. So this is the world that I live in. I did surrealist poetry before I went into law, so that's my world. You can see it's quite a mess. It's certainly not boring, but there are learned people there and somewhere. And this is your world. Still complicated, but at least it looks a bit tidier. But to get back to the right to benefit, you'll see the Universal Declaration here, and I'll conclude. The goal of such a novel human rights approach is to reorient our conversation from policing science to governing society, and would shift our focus from avoiding risks to protecting opportunities. So I'll close with that, and it has to be international. And then if none of you agree with anything I said, I do have a friendly little dog at home that might come after you. And I'm sure I'll share the data. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bartha. That was absolutely fantastic and really illuminating.
We do have time for a few questions before our networking lunch. Okay.
Bartha, it's been many years.
Yes, good to see you again. Hi.
Nice to see you. Human Genome Project, we worked on it during my second or third term as Privacy Commissioner, and you helped us to protect the data from unauthorized access by employers, insurers, etc. You referred to my privacy by design. I think in a possibly negative way, I'm not sure, but I wanted to point out that privacy by design, the seven foundational principles, is positive sum, not zero sum. The intention was always to ensure that data, I'm a big fan of AI and the amazing discoveries that are going to result from that. But the whole intent was that you have to be able to have data and data analytics and privacy, that one couldn't be used at the detriment of the other. And as you may know, concern for privacy is at an all-time high. I've been in this business way over 20 years, and I've never seen public opinion polls, Pew Internet research, etc., where the concern for privacy is in the 90 percentile, consistently, 90%, 92% of those surveyed, very concerned about the privacy and the lack of control. But you're absolutely right. 2 slides before, you said privacy has to be about control, personal control over the uses of your data, and autonomy, and I couldn't agree with that more. It's all about control. But and in terms of the GDPR, as you mentioned that it protects pseudonymous data, but it also has a role for anonymous data, and for the first time it has privacy by design in it, and privacy as the default setting, resorting back to getting consent from individuals. So while I value enormously the need for data and personalized data, etc., the thought that somehow overlooking is the wrong word, but paying less attention to the protection of that data, that's not going to come back to harm individuals, I can assure you, in all my years as privacy commissioner, the harm to individuals is dramatic when your data, without your control, is accessed by unauthorized parties, and it can come back to harm you dramatically. So I just want to emphasize the positive sum nature of privacy and data utility and big data and AI, not one versus the other.
No, I mean, that's part of the anticipatory governance model, is how to imagine the future new uses of data and of more data, big data, in a responsible way, but in an innovative way, not solely individualistically based, because a healthcare system is about citizens. It's not about a person living by themselves in a cave. I mean, you are a citizen paying into and benefiting from a system. So you have to have, at a certain level, a systems approach to it, where all citizens, for instance, well, there are countries that do this, would use medical records and leftover samples and so on to make sure, you know, that there's a level of quality of care, that communicable infectious diseases are not on the rise, that they can predict where they're going to be targeted resources have to be targeted there, because not everybody's at risk for H1N1, and so on. And at that minimal level of data sharing, I think a society can't work, a healthcare system certainly cannot work without that kind of data sharing. Your own data in a research context, you decide whether you want to participate or not. You decide whether you want to give your data even for future unspecified uses, subject to ethics. That's a personal decision. That's where you exercise your control. Or if in medical care, if you want pills versus injections, you exercise your control. You cannot say to someone in a hospital, no one can see my medical record. It has to be accessible to be used and to be updated and transferred and so on. So I see it more on the citizen level than I do as an individual versus society. I don't see that. I see the healthcare system has to function as a quality system, providing stewardship of the data, not just custodianship. You know, that's a big model difference. Yeah.
Michael.
Fantastic talk. Thank you very much. A lot of the talks seem to focus on consent and assumptions that there was a mechanism for consent to be provided, but we live in a world where a lot of the data that we work with in health and other spheres is not consent-based, where we have data through administrative means and otherwise. So I guess my question would be, are you suggesting that we should be moving towards a world where consent is universally sought from individuals on the use of data, even if it is sort of one which can't anticipate all the future uses? And I guess two questions to that. One is, what does consent mean if you're asked to consent to things that when no one really knows what they're describing, just consent to a bunch of uses down the road which we can't really describe, we don't know what they're going to be. So what does it mean? And number two, in that model where you have patients who are not giving consent, or as under the GDPR where you can remove your data from data sets, if that does start to happen at any kind of scale, I would contend that there are significant risks to the representativeness of those data sets, and therefore their use for all sorts of purposes, including AI and so on. And that presents a risk to the entire society for the kinds of insights that can arise from data. So how do you balance those things? Number one, I guess first question is consent. Is that should we all be moving to a world of consent? And B, what about the risks of consent where consent can be denied at scale?
Well, the consent is a really weak crutch. Studies have shown almost immediately after, or even that most people can't remember what they consented to. The clinical trials consent are a real hoot. I mean, they're 25, 27 pages. I mean, I work with pharma. I think, well, we have to protect ourselves. We have to show that there's a signature. They've put little initials on every page and everything. A lot of it's symbolic. It gives a semblance of control, but how much understanding is there at the individual level to make it really the foundation for an ethical research framework? I think what we need is much more transparency on how the system works, where the data is going or not going, where it's coming from, what it's being used for. And I think then when you walk in a hospital, you will You will trust, you know that your data is going to be used, your leftover samples are going to be used to calibrate the machines. Your basic data of age, disease, drug history, and so on will be put together in the system to help tailor drug to you. I think using the signature consent is a panacea, but it's unfortunately not strong enough to sufficiently protect choices that people want to make. And I think if they know what's happening, they can agree or not agree to it. That's the right to know, not to know, the right to access, the right not to participate, and so on, which is different from saying, I've consented now, anything can happen. And nobody knows what happens once they consent. That's another thing. There's no two-way communication. So the stewardship model is one where you not only know that the hospital or institution is the custodian, has it, but you know what's being done with it. You know, I can go to the, so there's more transparency, which creates trust. And we are in a, what the Americans like to call, I just was in Boston, socialized medicine. We are in a country that has chosen universal, accessible, portable healthcare. So someone from Alberta needs to be able to access their records when they're in Quebec in a car accident, and so on and so on. We cannot realize universal, accessible, portable, and sustainable, most of all, healthcare without more data sharing. We simply cannot afford it in the future because we have to stratify, we have to target, we can't just offer everything to everybody. So it's a choice that you have to put in your legislation.
Shannon? Yes, Alison. I have two questions, and they're distinct but follow on to your excellent talk. First one is your juxtaposition in the new world of patient and the healthcare system versus the old world of patient-physician-centered medicine. And that is such a traditional component of our system. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on how you see getting from here to there, because physicians, for one, are a very strong lobby group, and they have basically control of that relationship, and I'm not sure how I see physicians interacting with the broader healthcare system to devolve that responsibility. So that's question one.
Probably just one question.
Okay.
Yeah, we're finding out in the Global Alliance, like the genomics epi community has finally sort of really gotten into the culture of data sharing as being a plus, not only for the quality of the science, but a plus for the knowledge that comes out that will help citizens around the world. But it says the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health. So we are now entering the healthcare system in order so that genomics data comes in, genomic data comes out, and so on. And we are finding exactly that, speaking in French again, divide between physicians still being very much, you know, only their patients and not seeing the bigger healthcare systems picture in terms of how every patient can or could or should be treated, not just their patient. So we are facing that. I thought they would be really pleased to have more precise genomic and give some over to researchers as well, back and forth. But it's been a cultural shock to see they're still in the classical mode.
So I'm going to have one last question here, but then there is the networking lunch that Bartha's staying for. And Bartha, when you say the genomics community is activating this right, you know, genomics is part of what we're going to do with machine learning and AI, but it's just a portion. Do you have high-level advice for how we as a community can activate this right?
Well, I think by building what you're building in a way that doesn't undo the kind of that makes it seem normal, like it's called, you know, artificial. You really got a problem right there. Let's say nothing of intelligence. So there are probably social, cultural, political issues more than the actual quality of what you're working on, which of course is what everyone's scared of, the black box business about the algorithm taking on a life of its own and being so learned that nobody knows how it got there or what it means. But I think you have to in that community as well, build infrastructure science as essential for discovery science. And once they see the benefits of infrastructure science, like the Human Genome Project was an infrastructure science, the discovery people who want to use it will come and they'll trust it. But I think you've got a public issue as well as a scientific,
Okay, well, at least now we have more to bring to the table as we fight the good fight in terms of public benefit and how data can contribute to it. So please join me again in thanking